Okay, it's 6 o'clock, so we'll make a start. Thank you very much for all those who have come, who've made the trip to the LMI to come. There's other people who've joined online, so welcome to you as well. Please put in, if you're online and you want to ask questions or you're having any problems, just put it in the chat and I'll be monitoring it from just to the side here. But otherwise, we're very happy to welcome Captain John Hutchinson tonight, who's going to talk to us about the Concorde crash in Paris, which many of us will know about. You'll know that because I'm an obstetrician, we focused the lecture series this year on the maternity services. And I've had to fairly quickly turn around and say this isn't a metaphor for the maternity services, the Paris crash. It is different, but I hope we'll be fascinated and inspired. So Captain John Hutchinson started his flying life in fast jets for the RAF and retired there from 1966 to fly for BOAC, which became British Airways, and then flew Concorde for 15 years, from 1977 until 92. Where he met multiple royalty and celebrities, as I think probably everybody did who were captains on Concorde. Is that right? But we'll maybe hear a bit more about that. So many of us remember the Concorde crash in Paris in 2000, when an Air France Concorde passenger jet on a flight from Paris to New York crashed shortly after takeoff and killed 109 people on board. But Captain Hutchinson was very well placed to know all the details, and I think will tell us maybe some of the things that we got told as members of the public, and maybe some interesting insights and maybe an alternative story as well. So very pleased to welcome you. Please put your hands together for John Hutchinson.
Well, thank you very much for that introduction. Can you hear me all right? Yeah. Well, that's good. I think the first thing I'm going to say is that this is not a talk I like giving. It's one that makes me feel very depressed. The reason I do the talk fundamentally is because the French in their accident investigation laid the blame on two things: a piece of metal on the runway and design weaknesses in Concorde. I've flown over 70 different aircraft types in my flying career, and I can say without any question at all that I regard Concorde as probably the safest airplane I've ever flown in. Why do I say that? Because it was an airplane that had incredible reserves of power. It was incredibly responsive to, I suppose you could equate it to a Formula One racing car or thoroughbred racehorse. It was that sort of category of aeroplane. So that laying of the blame, or partial blame on the aeroplane, was a complete injustice, and it gets me very, very upset. In fact, the crash was a classic aircraft. Well, in fact, a classic accident. Doesn't matter whether it's an air accident. All accidents, or pretty much all accidents, are a chain of events, not one single cause. And it was the cumulative effect of all these things that were done wrong that led to the final catastrophe. Now, the flight itself was a charter flight. It was chartered by a small town in Germany to take predominantly German passengers. I think there were one or two others who were not Germans on board, but certainly predominantly it was a German charter carrying a lot of Germans to join the cruise ship, the Deutschland, and they were going to go through from New York on the Deutschland. They were going to go through the Panama Canal, across the Pacific to Sydney for the Sydney Olympics. So this was a trip of a lifetime. And you can imagine that those passengers were not exactly traveling light. They were traveling with their dinner jackets, their ball gowns, the whole shebang. And you'll see later on in my talk the relevance of that. The flight was scheduled to take place on the 25th of July, 2000. Now, about 3 or 4 days before the crash, and just before we... where's that not cycling? It's not responding. Perhaps I better use your...
It's working. Let's try that. Just using the mouse. Use these two here.
Okay. We'll just have a look at a couple of pictures of an Air France aircraft. I think the things I'd draw your attention to are the delta wings, which were full of fuel, and the tank at the tail end of the airplane, tank 11. That is also a significant fuel tank in this story. It's not going to work, so do it that way. That's another picture of a Air France Concorde coming into land. Now, as I was saying, about 3 or 4 days before the crash, the airplane had been in the engineering hangar at Charles de Gaulle Airport. And there'd obviously been some problem with that undercarriage. That's the left-hand undercarriage. And they had stripped that undercarriage completely down to its component parts. And then they rebuilt it. And in the process of rebuilding it, they forgot to put back in there a component called a spacer, which ran between the far pair of wheels that are obscured by the ones you can see on the foreground. So you've got the right-hand pair of wheels and the left-hand pair of wheels on this undercarriage truck. And the spacer was a sort of sleeve that ran between the two pairs of wheels. And it did its principal job was, as the name implied, kept that two pairs of wheels spaced. But not only did it do that, it kept the wheels locked in proper fore and aft tracking alignment. With that spacer missing, there was the possibility that those wheels could wobble around like wheels on a supermarket trolley. And there is a sort of schematic picture of the spacer as it runs between the left-hand and right-hand pair of wheels. Now, again, on the day in question, and it's absolutely nothing to do with the accident at all, this, but it does say something about Air France and its approach to things. Pilots have to go for a medical every 6 months. And when you pitched up for work in British Airways, you had to produce your license and show the people at the sort of check-in desk that your license was valid for the flight. And if it hadn't been valid, you'd be sent home and the standby bit would be called out. The first officer's license had expired 8 days before the crash. So fundamentally, it was actually an illegal operation because Concorde was certificated to be flown by a fully licensed flight crew, and that fully licensed flight crew consisted of a captain, a first officer, and a flight engineer. So that first officer with an invalid flying license actually invalidated the whole operation in pure legal terms. As I say, it had nothing to do with the aircraft accident, but it does say something about Air France and the way it sort of conducts its business, shall we say. Now, there's a picture of Charles de Gaulle Airport, and the runway they were using was runway 26 right. That's the runway. I don't know if this pointer will. Oh, that's interesting. Anyway, it's the two runways there at the bottom. It's the.
Is that? Got a little bit of
No.
shirt on there, I think.
Does it show it on the? Okay. Oh, yes, I can do it that way. Yeah. That's runway 26 right there, and 26 left there. That shorter runway. The first few 100 meters of this runway, just go to an expanded picture here. That first few 100 meters there was resurfacing work going on. And the fully prepared runway surface started at this point here, leaving just that amount of runway left for the takeoff. The captain on the day had a discussion with air traffic control about this, and he said, look, I want the full length of runway. I'm going to be a very heavy aeroplane, and I want to use the full length. And it was pointed out to him that it was, it wasn't a fully prepared runway surface there. And he said, no, that doesn't matter. I'd like the full length. So he opted to use that full length. And the only point I'd make at this stage is that there was a ledge there when you transitioned from the the section of runway which was still work in progress to the fully prepared runway surface. As you transitioned from one to the other, there was a ledge. The captain authorized the refuelers to override the normal refueling systems. The normal refueling systems on Concorde cut off the fuel refueling process at about 90% of tank capacity, so that there was airspace left in the tanks. He authorized overriding that system, filling up the fuel tanks. And in particular, a tank that will be featuring later on in the talk, tank number 5, that was actually filled 100% full. The flight crew were now on board the airplane doing their checks, and it turned out that there was a problem with one of the thrust reversers, and the flight was now going to be delayed by about 50 minutes to an hour while the thrust reverser was fixed. And that was quite correct that he insisted on having that fixed before departing, because if he'd had to reject the takeoff, he would have needed all that thrust reverse to have brought it to a safe halt if he was abandoning the takeoff. Here I'm speculating. And by the way, I should have said at the beginning, a lot of this information I've got from a chap called Mike Bannister, who was the chief pilot on Concorde and was part of the UK accident investigation team that went out for the accident investigation post the crash. A ground engineer called Ricky Bastin, who was also part of that team, and also Concorde, Air France Concorde captain called Jean-Marie Chauve. So all this information I'm giving you comes really from those sources. So he has now authorized the fixing of this reverse thrust. And as I say, it delayed him by about nearly an hour. And I think this is has to be speculation, obviously. But I guess that would have put him under a certain amount of pressure because he knew he's taking these passengers to join this cruise ship, the Deutschland, and cruise ships tend not to hang about. You know, when the time to depart comes up, they have to depart because somebody else may be booked in for that berth. And it could well have meant that his passengers would have missed the Deutschland in New York and would have then had to have been positioned down to Fort Lauderdale or Miami or wherever the ship was going to next to catch up with the ship there. And he certainly wouldn't have wanted that. So once the thrust reverser was fixed, there was a certain pressure on him to get the hell out of there and get going as quickly as possible. About 20 minutes before they departed, the dispatcher comes up onto the flight deck and he says, "Captain, we're going to have to leave 19 bags behind." And the captain says, "Why have you got to do that?" And he says, "Well, you're overweight and you're beyond the aft limits of center of gravity, and that's going to make things even worse." And the captain said, "Oh," he said, "is there space to put them in there?" And he says, "Yes, there was space to put them." And where they put them was in a freight hold at the back there. So 19 bags were loaded into a cargo hold right there where that pointer is. And there they stayed. What they weighed, we will never know. But I think, bearing in mind what I said earlier, that they were joining this ship for a sort of voyage of a lifetime, probably you're talking about 600 or 700 kilos worth of weight. He'd also decided to take 2 tons of taxi fuel. Now, at Heathrow, we never used more than 1.2 tons of taxi fuel. And frankly, I don't know why. Well, I do know why he chose 2 tons. It was because he wanted to just take as much fuel as possible with him on that flight. And that fuel, that 2 tons of taxi fuel, was located in tank 11 at that tail cone at the back end. So they go taxiing out from the terminal here, Terminal 2, and they taxied out and they went along here, along that taxiway there, down there to await their takeoff clearance. And here I'm just going to refer to some timings. He got his pushback permission clearance at 4:34 in the afternoon, French summertime. And he got to the holding point for the runway, that point right there. Where are you? He got to that holding point there at 4:42. So just 8 minutes later. So a very short taxi. And during that taxi, they obviously conducted all their checks. And here they are now at the holding point, and they request permission for takeoff. And they're given clearance for takeoff. And the clearance for takeoff was clearance to take off on runway 26 right, wind 0908 knots. Now, anybody has any understanding of flying will immediately realize that here we are talking about an airplane being cleared to take off in a westerly direction with the wind blowing from the east. So he was taking off with an 8-knot tailwind. So at this point here, he's not only over the maximum structural takeoff weight, he's not only beyond the aft limits of center of gravity, he's only burnt 800 kilos of that 2 tons of taxi fuel. So there's 1,200 kilos of fuel, 1.2 tons of fuel in tank 11 at the back, plus that 600 or 700 kilos of baggage that was never weighed. So you're talking about 1.75 tons to 2 tons of weight at the back end that shouldn't have been there, which is what accounted for the center of gravity being beyond the aft limits. And he's cleared for this takeoff with a tailwind. Effectively, when you factored in the tailwind, it meant that the airplane was something like 6 to 7 tons over the weight it should have been at. The speeds that were being used on that particular occasion, and there are 3 critical speeds during a jet takeoff, a jet airplane takeoff. V1, which is a decision speed, and anything that happens by way of an emergency below V1, you reject the takeoff onto the reverse thrust, your wheel brakes, and you bring the airplane to a safe halt on the remaining length of runway. After V1, whatever that emergency is, whatever it is, even if it's an engine fire, you take it into the air and you wait until you're safely climbing away, and then you call for the appropriate drill to be carried out and then deal with it as appropriate. The next speed is rotate, and that's the speed at which the pilot pulls back on the control column and presents, in Concorde's case, that delta wing at an angle to the airflow, and the airplane lifts off and takes to the air. And the final speed is the safety speed, the minimum safety speed for the weight and weather conditions on the day. And that's the V2 speed. So the speeds on that day, the V1 speed was 155 knots, the rotate speed was 198 knots, and the V2 speed was 220 knots. So they've now lined up on the runway, and off they go down the runway. And by the way, neither the co-pilot nor the flight engineer questioned any of the decision-making process. The captain concerned was an iconic figure in Air France. He wasn't an overbearing sort of person, but he was considered to be an ace pilot, and he'd done all sorts of amazing things like sort of windsurfing across the Atlantic and goodness knows what. He was a sort of heroic, idolized figure, highly respected and deeply respected as being a very, very fine pilot. So I think the whole attitude of the co-pilot and the flight engineer on that day was, well, if the captain thinks it's okay to go ahead, I'm happy to go along with it. There was no sort of questioning, oh, hang on a minute, Captain, we better just look at this. We've got a tailwind. Should we consider requesting permission to go right the way down to the other end of the runway and take off in the opposite direction, which basically is what should have happened. And if they'd done that, of course, they'd have burnt off all this excess fuel and the whole chain of events would have been totally different. But no, they went along with it and no questions asked. Now, there were witnesses. There were 18 very credible witnesses whose evidence was completely ignored in the accident investigation. And the most significant of those witnesses was an Air France 767 pilot who was sitting right there at that point there where I've got the pointer. So he had a ringside view of this whole takeoff. He was sitting there waiting for his turn to take off after the Concorde had departed. We'll come back to him later. The airplane goes off down the runway. And it gets to this point here where there's this ledge that I was referring to. Now, at this point, the missing spacer takes on a critical importance, because when it hit that ledge, it skewed the wheels around. And it caused some damage to the undercarriage. And in point of fact, there was a penetration of tank number 2, which is a tank located very close to the undercarriage. And fuel was dripping out of that tank onto the undercarriage leg. And because the wheels were skewed and the wheels were now being dragged sort of sideways down the runway, it was causing a lot of heat to be generated, and a fire broke out in that left-hand undercarriage at a very, very early stage of the takeoff. And that Air France 767 pilot absolutely swears that he saw smoke and flames in that left-hand undercarriage leg very early on in the takeoff. And almost certainly what caused it was that transition when it went over that ledge, and the fact that the spacer was missing caused those wheels to skew around. And there were 17 other very credible witnesses, like airport fire people and other perfectly credible sort of observers who also confirmed seeing smoke and flames coming from that left-hand undercarriage. They've gone past V1, and down around this area here, the airplane runs over that strip of metal, strip of titanium that had fallen off a Continental Airlines DC-10. And that strip of metal carved off, and I'm going to just remind myself of the amount. No, it hasn't got it here. Okay. It was a 2.5 kilo lump of rubber that was carved off this front right-hand wheel on that left-hand undercarriage. So that 2.5 kilo lump of rubber was carved off that wheel. And here, left lying on the runway, is that 2.5 kilo lump of rubber. Now you can imagine, I've never actually tried to work it out. In fact, somebody did work it out for me. I wonder if I've got it written down. No, I haven't. Anyway, it doesn't really matter. But it doesn't require much effort of imagination to appreciate that the airplane at this stage, it went over that piece of metal doing 175 knots, 200 miles an hour. So I don't know what the rotational velocity on the wheel was, but that 2.5 kilo lump of rubber must have parted company with that wheel with almost the velocity of a missile. And it went slamming into tank number 5. And tank number 5, and this is something else I should have mentioned, at the beginning of the takeoff, the captain instructed the flight engineer, because he knew that his center of gravity was beyond the aft limits, he instructed the flight engineer to pump fuel from tank 11 at the back of the airplane up the length of the airplane to try and get that center of gravity back forwards just as quickly as he possibly could. So there was fuel being pumped from tank 11 forwards into the wing tanks and that delta wing. So tank number 5, which was already full anyway, was now being pressurized because it was having fuel replaced into it from tank 11 at the back end of the airplane. So on this impact, when this piece of rubber slammed into the underside of the wing, and by tank number 5, it set up a shockwave in that tank, and there was nowhere for the energy in that shockwave to go. It had to go somewhere, and it was actually an explosion of fuel out of the tank, not a penetration of rubber into the tank. And that led to a sort of hose pipe of fuel gushing out of that, it was quite a big hole, so it was absolutely pouring out of that fuel tank. It came down and impacted onto the left-hand undercarriage leg where there was already a fire, and that was the ignition source for the dreadful flames that eventually sort of consumed the aeroplane. Also left on the runway was that piece of metal there, which came off the undercarriage. That's a thing called a water deflector, and it's that little component there that you can see there. So here's some pictures. I mean, these are really truly harrowing pictures here. Dreadful to look at. There she is at an early stage during the takeoff. There she is now with the fuel pouring out of that tank number 5. And you can see the flame consuming that wing. There she is lifting off. And sort of here you can almost see where the hole in the tank was. And you can see now that that blowtorch of flame was going right past the inboard intake on that engine and overheating that engine, which led, in fact, to a fire warning. And as the airplane lifted off at a radio altimeter height of 20 feet, the flight engineer, completely uncommanded, did a fire drill on that engine and shut it down without even informing the captain that he'd done it. What he should have done was to have cancelled the fire warning bell, which wasn't a conventional engine fire warning. It was a fire warning bell caused by the overheating of that engine by that plume of flame going past it. And it should have then just waited until it was safely climbing away and then carried out the drill under instructions from the captain, but that process didn't happen. And I'm not going to suggest that this was a significant error in the error chain. I think probably the fact that that engine was shut down in that way at 20 feet radio altimeter height would have had no bearing on the outcome of the crash at all. But it is true to say that that engine, whilst it wasn't producing full power, it was producing a significant amount of power, and it certainly wasn't helpful in any way to have that engine shut down. The other thing that happened as a result of going over that 2.5 kilo lump of rubber is that the airplane actually deviated off the left-hand side of the runway. And we'll see, these are just pictures, endless pictures of the airplane in flight with that plume of flame behind it. Now here are some pictures of the runway itself. This particular one we're looking at, that white area there is the runway. That grey area there is the hard shoulder. And there you can see very clearly the scorch marks left from that plume of flame. And you can see from that picture there that those scorch marks are going off in that direction, veering away to the left of the side of the runway as you were viewing it in the direction of takeoff. And some more pictures. There we can see the trail of rubber being left by those wheels that were scrubbing sideways down the runway, leaving a trail of rubber. There were no rubber trails left from the right-hand undercarriage leg because that undercarriage leg, the wheels were tracking in proper alignment. So all the wheels on the left-hand undercarriage leg were twisted sideways and scrubbing sideways along the runway and hard shoulder surface, leaving that trail of rubber. More, and there again you can see rubber trails. And so it goes on. And here you can see there's the runway, that white surface. This is the hard shoulder. And you can see there the trail left by that by the left-hand undercarriage. There is a steady trail left by the two left-hand wheels on that undercarriage truck. And there you can see one solid trail left by the rear right-hand wheel on that undercarriage truck, plus splodges there, splodge there, splodge there, splodge there, left by the remaining bits of rubber that were still attached to that front right-hand wheel. And you can see in the foreground there, this runway light had been damaged by the undercarriage truck as it went over. So not only have we punctured tank number 5 and we've got this blowtorch of flame, the other effect of that missing spacer was that the wheels skewed right round and steered the airplane off the left-hand side of the runway. And here we can see this very clearly, the trajectory as the airplane goes off to the left there, out over there. Now, this is something that I learned from this Air France Concorde pilot or captain, I should say, whom I got to know very well, a chap called Jean-Marie Chauve. And he said, John, I was chatting to him one day, and he said, John, he said, did you know that an Air France 747 had landed on 26 left and was taxiing to a point here, that point there, and he was waiting for permission to cross the runway to go to the terminal after the Concorde had departed on its takeoff. And I said, yes, Jean-Marie, I did hear that there was a 747 parked there. And he said, well, do you know who was on board? So I've knocked off. I don't know, is the sound okay? Is it coming? Because I've knocked off a little bit of thing off the microphone with my gesticulations. Mustn't get myself so excited. Anyway, he said, do you know who's on board? And I said, well, I've no doubt there were a lot of Japanese tourists. So what are you trying to tell me? And he said, well, he said President and Madame Chirac were on board. They'd been on a state visit to Japan. I said, oh my goodness, really? He said, yes, absolutely. And then he said, have you any idea how close the Concorde came to hitting the 747? And I said, no, Jean-Marie, I have no idea at all. And he said, well, one of my very best friends was the captain of the airplane on that day. And he estimates that the Concorde missed his airplane by 20 feet. And I looked at Jean-Marie and I said, come on, Jean-Marie, you mean 20 meters? And he said, no, John, I do not mean 20 meters. He said, I mean 6 or 7 meters. I mean 20 feet. So there's no confusion on my part. That day, Air France came within 20 feet of one of their Concordes, crashing into one of their 747s with the President of France and his wife on board. Now, it wouldn't have been the worst crash ever. In numerical terms, that still remains the dreadful one at Tenerife when a Pan Am and a KLM 747s collided on the runway. And I think about 600 people lost their lives. But it would certainly have been a devastating event for Air France to deal with. And I would personally suggest that it would have been their sort of Lockerbie moment, the equivalent of Lockerbie and Pan Am. I think it could have very easily led to the end of Air France. And I can almost visualize the sort of sigh of corporate relief in Air France's headquarters that it wasn't something far worse, that it was only a Concorde that had crashed when it could have been so much worse. And I absolutely have no doubt at all in believing that from that moment on, Air France never, ever wanted to fly Concorde again. Unfortunately for them, they were locked into an agreement with British Airways. And British Airways certainly did not want to ground the airplane, and Air France very reluctantly had to agree to a process where they would do some modifications to the airplane to make it safer, and which is like waving incense at gods as far as I'm concerned. And the airplane would then go on flying again. But they did not want that to happen. They really didn't. I've jumped ahead of myself quite a bit here. We'll go back to the crash itself. The airplane has now missed that 747 by 20 feet. It never reached its safety speed of 220 knots. The maximum speed it reached was 218 knots. It never got to 200 feet. It got to about 190 feet. And basically, what happened eventually, about a minute and a half after it got airborne, and there's a sort of schematic showing the trajectory of the flight after it had got airborne. And it then reared up about 28 degrees, 30 degrees nose up, 110 degrees of bank, and crashed down into a hotel at Gonesse off the end of the runway. And in all, 113 people died that day. 109 of them were on the Concorde, and 4 of them were in that hotel. There were, incidentally, some very lucky school children from East Anglia. They were they were part of an orchestra, an East Anglian orchestra, and they were going for some orchestral event in Paris. And they were scheduled to be staying in that hotel, and their ferry had been delayed, and consequently they hadn't actually got to that hotel when the crash happened. So they were some very, very lucky youngsters that day. Here, just a few pictures of the sort of crash site. Dreadful, dreadful scene. Very painful to look at as far as I'm concerned. There you can actually identify sort of discernible bits of an aeroplane. And here we see the hotel that it crashed into, and there's the hotel and restaurant sign there. And there's a schematic that just shows roughly what sort of happened. And here again, similar sort of schematic. There's a memorial at Gonesse, and that's the memorial there, commemorating the people who lost their lives that day. And another memorial at Charles de Gaulle, that one there. Now, just very briefly to touch on the accident investigation. Mike Bannister, because it was a jointly certificated airplane, i.e. Anglo-French, we had a legal right to be part of that accident investigation. So the Air Accident Investigation Board included in their team Captain Mike Bannister, who's the chief pilot Concorde, and amongst other ground engineers, this chap Ricky Bastin I was referring to. And it was Ricky Bastin who, when he got out to France and was looking at the wreckage, identified the fact that the spacer was missing from that left-hand undercarriage leg. And he didn't say anything at the time to anybody, waited until they got back, the British team got back to the hotel, and he said, "Do you know the spacer was missing from that left-hand undercarriage leg? What significance do you think that might have had?" And there was a big discussion in the hotel that night as to what sort of significance that might have had. And then they informed the French about it the next day. And from that moment on, basically the French obstructed every attempt by the British side to access the wreckage to inspect component parts. And it was an absolutely appalling state of affairs. And I'm going to read to you, there was an addendum appended to the accident investigation written by the UK accredited representative. And here are some of the things he said. The French judicial authorities conducted a separate inquiry into the accident in parallel with the BEA. That's the Bureau Enquête des Accidents investigation. The manner in which the judicial investigation was conducted presented major impediments to the AAIB's participation in the technical investigation. The difficulties encountered are listed below. The French judicial authorities did not allow the AAIB to examine all items of the wreckage or to participate in component examinations. For example, the judicial authorities did not allow the AAIB to examine the strip of metal which burst the tire, did not allow the AAIB to examine that part of the tank 5 lower skin, which was found on the runway, except very briefly, did not allow the AAIB investigators to participate in the examination of most of the flight deck controls and instruments, did not allow the AAIB to be systematically involved in the examination of evidence. The French judicial authorities did not allow the AAIB full access to all relevant evidence as soon as possible. For example, they severely restricted access of investigators to the crash site, withheld photographic evidence of the runway surface for 6 weeks, evidence which later proved very valuable in understanding the events on the runway, and significantly hindered the prompt examination of evidence. This introduced significant delays to necessary safety actions. The French judicial authorities specifically prohibited advisors to the UK accredited representative from participating in the examination of major components for which the UK had primary airworthiness responsibility. For example, they prohibited examination by the AAIB of the engine bays and wing equipment bays. They prohibited examination by the AAIB of the landing gear selector mechanism. The AAIB investigators and their advisors were offered access to a limited number of examinations on the condition that they signed a commitment to the judicial investigation. This confidentiality agreement placed unacceptable restrictions on the use of the subsequent evidence and was therefore not signed. These obstructions to UK participation were in contravention with the state of occurrences obligations under the Chicago Convention. It is also in contravention of the European Council Directive, which states investigators should be able to complete their tasks unhindered. Furthermore, the restrictions and procedural delays imposed by the judicial authorities subverted the directive requirement that air safety requires investigations to be carried out in the shortest possible time. So that's what the UK team in that accident investigation thought about the manner in which that investigation has been conducted. So that's it, really. That's the whole series of events that led to that dreadful day. And as I hope I've been able to convince you, it was a classic aircraft accident. It was a chain of events. It was an error chain. And when all those holes in the Swiss cheese lined up, we got that final disastrous crash. And I'm just going to finish off now. Is that all right with you? So if I just show,
Yeah, please do.
It's about a 12-minute video. Gets me very sad. This is the last day of Concorde operations, and it's events at Heathrow. The final farewell.
Just the thrill of this, the noise, the beauty, the speed. I've been following Concorde since 1969, from its maiden flight to this day. Get back to you later in a minute. Let's look at the day, it still looks futuristic. I just think the public love her. She's just so special. It's the only plane that you can pick over and everybody turns and looks up. I cried as she went off, so it's so emotional. It's so special. I think even at check-in, people checking you in, the moment starts there, really.
It's an incredibly first day for me because I've spent the last 5 years cabin crew on board, which is sharing Concorde. It's also incredibly exciting about sharing and put on an event such as this. We can all share a pass today.
It's that feeling of knowing that you're 60,000 feet up in the air and travelling at fast the speed of sound.
Sheer beauty of it, the power of it, the speed of it. It's just, it has a magical feel about it.
There's no feeling like it, but I can't find the right words to say what exciting movie it is to fly on Concorde.
Business people say it's all so much quicker and it saves some time. That really didn't come into it as far as I was concerned. It was just the glamour, the elegance, the thrill of going on this wonderful white bird.
It's been my absolute privilege to be a Concorde pilot on this beautiful aeroplane for the last 4 years. As I speak to you now, 3 Concordes are in the air, heading to London Heathrow for a historic triple landing, the final landing in airline service. The first aircraft due to land this afternoon is Edgeworth as Alpha Echo, flown by Captain Les Brody, a man who taught me, amongst others, to fly. Second aircraft flown by Captain Paul Douglas, and in the distance, Speedbird 002, the last ever supersonic service to New York, flown by the chief pilot Concorde, Captain Mike Bannister. Aircraft steering the ground now, the engineer will be calling 100 feet, 50 feet, 40, 30, 20, begin to check back, 10, and a beautiful touchdown, absolutely stunning sight.
Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to propose a toast to Concorde. This is the many men and women of British Airways who have made it such a special part of our life. To Concorde.
What struck me most of all are the smiles of people around here, meeting old friends, people I haven't seen for ages, seeing people who really have meant that Concorde can survive and prosper in British Airways for 27 years. They're a great bunch of folks.
It really is a family. Everybody's really engaged in this day emotionally, and it's been a really incredible day.
Just look at some of the people around here. You'll see a tear in quite a few people's eyes.
After some 140 million miles of commercial service, with 2.5 million passengers, it is time for Concorde to retire. And Concorde has simply been one of the defining icons of our age.
I think today we've given her the send-off that she really deserves. She will retain the wow factor for many years to come.
All those who work and have worked with Concorde have been regarded as an elite, of whom very high standards were always expected, and you have not let us down.
Best thing in life I've ever done. It's something that I'll treasure for the rest of my life.
Well, that concludes my presentation, ladies and gentlemen. And I think I was actually at Heathrow with Raymond Baxter in a small makeshift BBC studio with Dermot Monahan and John Sopel. And I'm told that Raymond Baxter's body language and my body language, we didn't need to say anything. We were in a state of deep gloom and depression. And I think it's safe to say, let me put it this way, that if that crash in Paris had not happened in July 2000, a crash that should never have happened, in my opinion, absolutely should never have happened. If that crash hadn't happened, Concorde would still have been flying for another 10 years, at least, possibly 15 years. So there's no doubt in my mind that that Paris crash was the catalyst that led to the premature grounding of the aeroplane. Because as I've hopefully illustrated to you, Air France never wanted to fly it again after that crash. Anyway, I'm now quite happy to take questions if anybody wants to.
Well, first of all, thank you so much. That was, what a fascinating story. Thank you. I mean, as somebody who works in maternity, each one of those things, I mean, we often talk that we should do investigations similar to those in the aircraft industry, and you can see the delays, you can see the lack of teamwork, you can, all those things, the things it'll be okay, but when you get the Swiss cheese and it puts it all together, yeah, sobering story. Questions?
Silence, Joel.
Yes, please. Yes.
Could the pilot have done anything to terminate the takeoff, given that this happened fairly early on? It sounds from your description as if the wheels turned fairly early on and would have created an almighty shuddering. I mean, was that too late for the captain to say, right, stop?
I'm not sure it would have caused an almighty shuddering. When it crossed that ledge, there was a spike, a longitudinal G-force acceleration shown on the flight data recorder. And there was also a slight swooshing sound, like the sort of sound of a firework going off, that was recorded. But I don't think he would have felt the sort of drag on that undercarriage leg, and I don't suppose he would have felt much in the way of shuddering or anything like that. The Concorde takeoff with 4 reheats on, it was pretty dynamic. There was a heck of a lot going on. No, I don't. What I would say was that if he could have seen the extent of the damage, the mortal damage that had been done to the airplane, even though he'd passed V1, I don't think he would have gone into the air with it. If he could have seen the extent of that flame and the way it was consuming the wing, I think he'd have just said, to hell with that. I'm going to reject the takeoff and take my chances about going off the end of the runway. But he didn't. He couldn't see that. You can't, sitting on the flight deck up there, you can't see the wing at all. Even if you put your sort of nose right up against the sort of side view window, you cannot catch a view of the wing at all. So he didn't have the benefit of that visual picture image being presented to him. So no, I don't think there's anything he could have done really. Once he'd passed V1, he was committed to going into the air with it. Yeah, we've got a... Yes, please.
Thank you for a great dissection. And the Swiss trees concept, of course, it is very prominent in medical research, using the air company's investigations as the absolute classic example of multifactorial disasters, using the Swiss cheese concept. And is there a history within Concorde of other near misses?
Well, in fact, Air France had another, wasn't a near miss, it was actually, they were a bit careless with their Concorde fleet. They started off with 7 Concordes in the same way as British Airways started with 7 Concordes. At the conclusion of the Concorde project, they only had 5 left. In 1978, one of their airplanes was coming in from Brazil, from Rio de Janeiro, coming to land at Dakar in Senegal. And the pilot got too close into the runway, and instead of repositioning and giving himself more space, so that he'd come down on a sort of 3-degree glide slope towards the runway, he decided not to do that and increased the rate of descent. And what he actually did, in fact, was plant the airplane very heavily onto the runway. He didn't check the rate of descent properly and touched down with a sort of rate of descent of 600 or 700 feet a minute, quite a heavy bang onto the runway. Nobody was actually seriously injured. Nobody was killed. So they were able to cover it up pretty effectively. And what they actually did, the airplane was damaged. It actually damaged the sort of pressure hull of the airplane. And what they in fact did in the end was to fly it home in short stages, unpressurized, in short hops, all the way back to Charles de Gaulle. And it then became a source of spare parts for Air France for their other airplanes. So they did have a bit of a track record, I'm afraid. So my views about Air France are not very complimentary.
Fair enough. Yes, please.
I just ask again, why was the British press right from the beginning giving us just the fact that the piece of metal on the runway was the cause of the accident, and it was all the fault of Continental Airlines? I mean, that was what was publicly announced for quite a long time in the British press and French press.
I can't answer for why the media sort of latched onto that sort of exclusively in that way. It's interesting. The French took Continental Airlines to court, which I find slightly bizarre. I mean, you could argue that the Paris Airport Authority were somewhat culpable in not having detected that there's a piece of metal floating about on the runway that could cause damage to an aeroplane. But there was no question of bringing any charges against Charles de Gaulle Airport. So they latched onto this Continental Airlines ground engineer who'd been responsible for fitting that piece of metal onto the engine cowling of that DC-10, which had taken off somewhat earlier before the Concorde flight. And they took him to court. He, of course, never appeared in France. So in absentia, he was found guilty and charged with corporate manslaughter, convicted of corporate manslaughter. Continental Airlines bought an appeal, and Mike Bannister, in fact, was one of the lead witnesses in that appeal process, talking on behalf of Continental Airlines. And in that appeal process, the original judgment was overturned. And so here again, one doesn't want to get into sort of funny conspiracy theories, but the French lawyer who represented Continental Airlines in that appeal hearing and successfully overturned that conviction against the Continental Airlines ground engineer. He was a chap who lived on a riverboat in the Seine, and as far as anybody knew, was in sound health. About 3 or 4 weeks after the appeal had overturned the original judgment, he was found dead in his riverboat. One sort of wonders whether state-sponsored assassination had taken place. He was certainly of considerable embarrassment to this French government and to Air France in overturning that original conviction.
Sobering. Should you take one last question and then we'll finish it? Thank you very much. The what? The external check before the, yeah. No, I didn't actually mention it. And in fact, the flight engineer would not have been able to pick up from that pre-flight check that the spacer was missing. It was something that you needed to look at much more closely. It was internal strip of metal that couldn't be seen from external inspection. So he would not have been able to identify that the spacer was missing, if that's the point of the question you were making. Yeah, no, he wouldn't have been able to. Well, that's truly fascinating. Thank you so much. I'm going to ask Derek Macon, who's chair of the LMI Management Council, to come and give a short vote of thanks. Thank you, Derek.
Thank you very much. Tom and I have the great pleasure of being absolutely connected. Sue and John.